Welcome to the Didrikson Art Museum podcast. Tove Jansson is an artist and author known around the world for her Moomin storybooks and cartoons, her paintings, and her short autobiographical novels. These elements are often experienced in isolation, the Moomin cartoons on their own, her paintings in a gallery, her books read on vacation on beaches and at cottages. Taken all together, they create a layered portrait of Tove Jansson, a human being choosing to create art continually as she moved through her remarkable lifetime. The Tove Jansson exhibition To Paint is to Be at the Didrikson Art Museum does just this, and as visitors move along a timeline of her evolution as a painter, the context of family, love, friendships, the artists around her, and the places in her world delivers a deeper experience. My name is Tom Wright, and today I'm speaking with Sophia Jansson, creative director of Moomin Characters Limited. She's also the niece of Tove Jansson. Sophia, thanks for being here. There's a lot to talk about with Tove Jansson because she had many interests as an artist and really had a fascinating life. And you have a perspective not only as creative director of Moomin Characters, but as Tove's niece, and of being close to her and in her life as a family member. Tell us a bit about Tove Jansson, the painter. What was she like?
You know, I know Tove basically as my aunt, and that means without a title, painter or writer or anything ahead of it. But of course, I knew that Tove was a painter already when I was a very young child because we'd go to exhibitions with her, and primarily, I would say, exhibitions of her own art. So, of course, I always knew that she was a painter. And when my father worked alongside Tove on all things related to the Moomin books, I, of course, learned that she did more than just paint. She wrote and she, in fact, sort of expressed herself in many different strains of art. But as a young woman, I got more interested in finding out what Tove had done when she was painting. And there were always lots of her paintings around in relatives' homes and of course in her studio. And so we'd talk about it a bit, but she was quite private when it came to her early artistic career. Because as you know, she was, by the 60s when I was born, she was already more famous as a writer of the Moomin books than she was as a painter.
So who were her influences as a painter?
Well, there were many painters that she loved and she admired and perhaps even copied. I think those who have studied her early career and done a lot of research into who might have influenced her style often cite Matisse, and Tove has herself in letters and in conversations mentioned him as an inspiration. But there were many others, especially illustrators. We find that there was Gustave Doré, for example, Edward Gorey, which people might know, and Swedish illustrators like Elsa Beskow, for example, was definitely one. Tove was, of course, of a generation where when you studied art, it was quite normal to actually copy other masters' paintings while studying painting. So she did that during her studies. But I think she was later definitely most interested in the narrative in a painting, and she also became a colorist, which perhaps is hard to see in some paintings from the war because they are, for lack of actual physical oil paint, sometimes perceived as a little bit gray. But she was definitely a colorist, I would say.
Your grandparents, Tove's mother, Signe, and her father, Victor, were also artists. Can you describe how that might have inspired her?
Well, Tove was born in 1914 into an artist family. Her father was a sculptor and her mother was an illustrator, or what today might be called a sort of a graphic designer. And so in her family, that was the way to earn a living, by making art of different kind. And I think both parents were very proud artists, and they thought art was the most important thing in life. And so when Tove grew up, it wasn't scorned upon to choose art as a profession. Quite the opposite. We know from letters that Tove's father wrote from the front when he was fighting in the civil war in Finland in 1918. He writes home to his wife and says, hopefully our little Toto will become a great artist. And of course, we know now that he couldn't have had any idea of how famous she would become. But I think this is important because when she chooses to study art, it's not a usual choice for a woman at that time. But the fact that both of her parents were completely behind her choices, and they in fact encouraged her choices to be an independent woman and choose a profession that was unconventional, was really very, very important for her future career.
That's great. It's a fascinating bit of context, not only of the Janssons' view of artists, but also of the times they were living in. I know that you visited her studio a number of times as you were growing up. What was it like to be in her painting studio?
Well, she moved into her studio in Ullanlinnankatu in the spring of 1944. So by the time I was born, she'd already lived there for 20 years. And it had changed in character. I think the early photographs we have, they show a much more conventional, traditional studio with easels and canvases on the floor. And she's actually painting in that little turret that is her studio in that big room with high ceilings. But in the 60s, when I visited her, or we visited her, we would often meet in what's called today Lilla Rummet, the little room, which is the sort of little entree room to the studio. And that's where she would receive visitors and, sit and talk to people there. There were doors that closed to the actual big studio room, and they would often be closed. She might have opened up the studio to especially her partner and my father and her mother to come and, critique or say something about some painting that was on the go. But my earliest memories, of course, are that it was more of a private space, and if you were invited into the actual studio, it was quite cold. And of course, now later on, I know that when Tove moved into her studio, it was right after that particular building had been bombed during the war, and so the windows were broken, and it took a while before the studio was actually made livable. It was never meant to be a flat as such, but a working space. But heating was put in very much later. So in the 60s, Tove is still painting in the studio with basically quite harsh conditions. And we know from her diaries, she makes notations of the temperature in the atelier, she called it, and then the little room. And this is probably from the 50s, but in those notes she says, lilla rummet 6 grader, ateliern 1 grad. And that's for those of you who think in Fahrenheit. It's in Celsius. It's quite cold. 1 degree is not a temperature you necessarily think that you might be comfortable working in. But it didn't bother her. She was used to quite harsh conditions, and she did work all winter long in that cold room. In the 60s, she has that period of abstract paintings. And so when I'm there as a little girl, those would be the paintings that I would see.
I know that Tove grew up in Helsinki and famously spent a lot of time in the archipelago and wrote about it. And she really valued the Baltic Sea and the maritime world of southern Finland quite a bit. She also studied art in Stockholm and spent time in Paris during her formative years. So my question is, what were the most important places in Tove Jansson's world?
I think, well, if one wants to sort of narrow it down to only a few, I would say actually her studio became incredibly important to her. That's where she lived in the wintertime, and it was more than a home and a studio. It became sort of a space where she felt she had the freedom to be herself. But another very important place, of course, was her house on the Kluvharu Island in the archipelago outside of the city of Porvoo. In that particular archipelago, her parents rented a fisherman's cottage already in 1920, and from that year on, they spent every summer in that same archipelago. And gradually, Tove moved away from the safe little inlet where the fisherman's cottage was and moved on to the outer islands. And then finally, in the 60s, with her partner, Tuuti, they get permission to build a very small house with only one room, but windows to all directions on Kluvharu Island. And they spend very long summers there. I mean, they move out there already as soon as the ice has disappeared, basically latest early May, and then stay there until the end of September. So their summers are about 5 months long. But for them, summer wasn't a time when they didn't work. I mean, they took their work with them. Tove worked continuously all throughout her life. But I would say those are the two most important places for her.
So along the same lines, in the same vein of personal time, what are some of your summertime memories with Tove and Tuuti in the archipelago?
Well, summertime memories are all a sort of wonderful, sunny, warm blur of water and swimming and picnics and boats and just having an absolutely wonderful time. But I think, because as I mentioned, their summers were very long. And also I think my summers were quite long because school holidays in the 60s were still about 3 months. So life changed. You sort of left your city life for a life on islands, and you just did a lot of nice things. I think we still do a lot of nice things, but especially in those days, it was a very carefree time. There were a lot of adventures. Basically, you'd row or take the motorboats to different islands and explore and find beautiful stones or shells or fly kites or fish or swim. And Tove, of course, even though she was 12 years older than my father, and so the age gap between me and Tove and Tuuti was big. There was never a sense that they weren't, ready to, dive into off of a high cliff into the sea or do the things that you wanted to do. I mean, a sort of age kind of disappeared, and everybody was, just enjoying themselves. For those of the listeners that are not familiar with the geographical location of Finland and the climatic conditions here, summer is very short and reasonably cold, but it's very intense because of that. Because everybody knows that long and dark winter is either behind us or ahead of us. And so people live to the full. And I think life on the islands, we were all living on islands that were very close to one another, so we'd see each other a lot. Especially, I think, because Tove and Tuuti lived on Kluvharu Island, which was a small island very far out at sea. They needed to be looked after in a sense. My father would go and drive out there with me minimum once a week, probably more often, to discuss works, but to bring water and the mail and to take Tove's letters back to the village to post them, and then of course in between there would be birthday parties or picnics or any other reason to visit. So actually social life on the islands was quite busy, and so we'd see each other a lot. And I think those are very fond memories now. I think life on the islands has changed a bit since those years, and perhaps what made them so special was that I think definitely Tove and Tuuti, but also my father, they had this desire to move out to the islands, to basically have this freedom to get up when they wanted, do what they wanted, work when they wanted, and perhaps not have to, I don't know, follow so many conventions, a kind of living on a deserted island, romantic idea with very sparse or harsh conditions, no electricity, no running water, sleeping in tents. It was a very sort of romantic sense of freedom, a little bit like Snufkin in the Moomin stories, but it was about being at peace with yourself. And I think the summers were very much about that.
I know that your company, Moomin Characters Limited, is very much involved in the Our Sea initiative and some other environmental causes. Was that on Tove's mind as well?
I think most definitely. I often say that the sea was more for her than just something beautiful to look at. It was her, if art was her first love, then the sea was her second. And that it was the inspiration to so many things for her. We see the sea in many of her paintings and in her illustrations being the setting for what she's trying to express. But of course, those long summers in the archipelago, and especially on Kloofharu Island, that was it is a small island with no trees, meant that she could watch the horizon and the sea 360 degrees around her. And not only having that incredible panoramic view, but she saw the changes in the weather. Probably the most prevalent element would be the sea, the waves, the wind. And she loved it. And I think it really shows in all of her work. You feel it. You feel her love of the sea in very many of her both paintings, but especially in her illustrations and in her writing.
There's a fair amount of deliberateness that was required to create that life on Kloofharu Island, to plan and spend such long periods during the summer there. It feels like there's a little parallel to the kind of determination and the world creating of her art, and just how she would create the places in her life to reflect her values, like the island in particular.
I think they had this sort of idea that material things aren't what it's really about. It's about something else. And life is about the atmosphere, the freedom you have to express yourself or be with yourself. And that what was most fun in life is the here and now. And also enjoying, today it sounds so, banal to say the little things, because they aren't little things. They are big things. But I mean, just to give you sort of a concrete example, I think this story has been told before, but when Tove and Tuuti had their house built on that little island on Kloofharu, during the building of the house, they put up a tent in a ravine. It was quite sheltered so that they could sleep there while the building was going on. And Tuuti built this sort of nice little wooden platform for it to stand on. And of course, Tove's and Tuuti's tent was nothing like a normal tent. It had little wooden boxes where they could keep their pens and their books. And, it was very nicely sort of organized and a real place where as I remember as a child, I'd always say, can I sort of crawl into your tent? Because it was just nice to be there. And of course, when the house was ready, everybody thought, okay, they'll move into the house. But in fact, what they did was they kept the tent and they put it up every summer in the ravine, and they slept in the tent most often because they just liked sleeping in the tent with the sound of the wind and the sea and the seagulls, and they felt at peace there. And then if they had guests, the guests would sleep in the house because it was one room, and so there wouldn't have been room for everybody in the house. And they were very, very much like that.
It seems like quite the summertime life. And there were such unique elements to the island and to Tove and Tuti's world that they created for themselves there. What were the sorts of things they could do in the nature there? And how do they manage to combine pleasure and work there?
They sort of, swimming in a rock pool with this special kind of seaweed that was, you can still find it, but unfortunately, because the Baltic is so polluted, it's becoming more rare. But there are rock pools where there's this seaweed that's it's small, little light green grass with bubbles in it. And when you touch it, it's like velvet. So there was a rock pool on Klovharon, which was called Sammetspotten, which is the sort of the velvet rock pool. And of course, it was a great thing when Tove said, "Oh, shall we go and swim in the velvet rock pool?" And you couldn't swim in it. You could just basically sort of glide into it. And but just the sensation of that seaweed under you was just so fascinating and so pleasurable. So little things like that was what made them tick. And of course, on the other side is, of course, a very, both Tove and Tuti were very determined with their work. So work was also kind of holy, and you couldn't disturb them if they were working. If they were doing something related to their work, they needed peace to be left alone to do that. And of course, between the two of them, they knew very well when the other person had that sort of period going on, and they left each other alone. But also, if you came as a visitor, you knew that if Tove was doing something important related to her work, you were not to disturb her. So there's always that going on as well. But I think Klovharon became the place where they could switch quite easily between, swimming in the rock pool and then concentrating on whatever was the most important thing in sort of work terms at that time.
I love the velvet rock pool, and I can picture it now with the soft seagrass velvet in it. And there's such a good city-country juxtaposition when you tell stories about the studio and then Klovharon. The contrast is incredible, and the shifting gears between her two worlds must have been pretty intense. In my reading for our talk, I remember you have a story about a summer exhibition one year and a mishap with a painting she was meaning to show. It really illustrates so much about the summers and the relationships in the family. Could you share that story with us?
I think today when people think about the archipelago, they don't understand that, say, for example, in the 60s, the islands were still very remote. There were no roads to get very near any island, and you went there by boat. You literally sort of packed in your winter home, and then you moved to the country. And only on very few occasions did you come back into town, and it was very, very rare. But of course, when Tove had an exhibition that was organized in the summer, and this was the case when she had to borrow a painting of hers that we had in my childhood home in Helsinki. In particular, there was one that now is part of the exhibition at Didriksen, which was meant to be exhibited at an exhibition during, I think it must have been late 60s. But as I mentioned, when everybody moved to the countryside, they sort of, the town flats were basically closed. But Tove needed the painting. And in those days, it wasn't that easy to go back into town as it is today. So she agreed with my father that he would just give her the keys. And when she went into town to prepare for the exhibition, she could go and pick up the painting from our home, which she did. But what he forgot to tell her was that, like so many in that crazy family, they stashed money in books and behind paintings and under vases and so on, because you never knew what might happen. And so there was this idea that you might need to make a quick getaway at some point. And so when Tove takes the painting, which is actually, she was a small woman, shorter than myself, and I'm 165 centimeters, so she was quite small, but she carries this painting along the street up to her studio, and she notices that people are sort of looking at her and sort of slightly laughing, and she sort of, I don't know, doesn't understand what's going on. And she looks behind her and she sees these notes of money flying down the street. And it's a summer's day, obviously. And of course, she understands immediately in a split second what's happened, because she knows her family and what they're like and what she's like. But of course, she thinks, oh my God, oh no, all Lasse's money is flying down the street. But people were really, amused by this. And so, of course, people very kindly kind of try to catch these flying notes in the street and pick them all up and hand them to her. And, all ends well. I mean, I'm probably pretty much all the money was collected by amused spectators. And then she gets the painting and everything. And of course, she has to recount the story when she meets Lasse again on the island, and I think it's so wonderful because, of course, instead of it being a catastrophe, they all, find it incredibly funny and amusing. And it has to be said, of course, money was quite scarce still in the 60s, maybe less so for Tove, but certainly they weren't wealthy by any means, and so they couldn't just, throw out money out the window and not care about it. But still, this ability to laugh at their own silliness or peculiarities, I think was very particular to them. They could sort of laugh at themselves, and I think that was a very, very nice quality. But yeah, it was sort of a typical memory of. They weren't, they were sort of always very, I don't know, serious about what they did when it came to work, but they were also very silly, basically, and very sort of romantic and foolish and strange and everything sort of packed into one.
That's a great story. It's wonderful that strangers were gathering, all the banknotes and navigating this unexpected situation like such good humans. It's a story that speaks to me to a time and a place really nicely. It also shows the energy that she brought to her career and the way that she lived, which gets me to the question of what drove Tove Jansson as a person?
Well, Tove was a very unique person because I think she was incredibly creative, and she had an amazing drive to express herself all the time, coupled with the understanding that the conviction that she wanted to be good at what she did. So she was forever trying to better her output. So she actually studies techniques. I mean, she's very meticulous about finding the exact expression in any given moment. I mean, we know this for a fact when she's making illustrations for the Moomin books. They are made 1-to-1 as they were printed, which means they were very small. But she didn't just make one illustration of the same scene. She could make 20, 30. And to an untrained eye, they might not be that different. But she was looking for the exact version of what she wanted to communicate in that particular illustration. And so she's very pedantic. And today, people use words like workaholic and obsessed. But she was forever rewriting stories, repainting paintings, because she was looking for the version that she was happy with. This until the very end. And I think I remember conversations with her about writing, and she would say that, of course, writing a novel is the easiest, and writing a short story is already much more difficult because you need to compress what you're saying in fewer words. And then, of course, writing a poem is the hardest of all, because that's where you use the least amount of words and text to express basically the same thing that you might try and say in a whole novel of 100 or 200 or 300 pages. And so in her career, we see that she goes really from quite an abundant narrative style to becoming more sparse all the time. And just to sort of connect to the painting side of her again, there's a painting called the Ugly Portrait that she painted in 1975, the period when she had her last sort of burst of painting, when she and Tuti were in Paris for a spring for 6 months in Cité des Arts. And she was meant to write during that time, but she just couldn't find the inspiration for that. So she sort of quite, spontaneously just started to paint. And of course, those very last paintings are the most wonderful, I think, of her whole painting career, and especially this portrait, because she calls it the Ugly Portrait because, of course, she suffered from aging, because that sort of decay of beauty. You become old, you become ugly, your skills are not what they used to be, and it's sort of, in essence, the end of life. But that portrait is very ruthless of herself. I mean, she's not painting herself beautifully, but very boldly, with a few strokes, sort of makes this portrait of herself. And it's, now that you look at it, it's very, free and fresh and somehow liberated, which is great if that's where she got at the end of her career with her painting. I don't know if she would have been as ecstatic as I am about that portrait then. Maybe she just sort of did it. But now, when you compare it to all her other paintings, it really is quite special. And for me, it's very heartwarming that she let go, basically. She completely let go. And that's very nice to think that she could actually do that at that age when she was plus 60.
That's such an interesting detail about that self-portrait, and it's a really nice insight about her at that time in her life. You talked about the sparseness that she admired. There's a wonderful quote I came across, and it's that, and I'm going to paraphrase, "Everything has its meaning, even the empty spaces." Could you describe this principle in Tove Jansson's work and in her life?
Yeah, Tove has said that the empty spaces are as important as basically the ones that are colored or filled in. And I think this is a very important idea that she carries with her throughout her artistic career. She obviously had a sort of a classical education in painting, so composition was one of the central things to study, and how to make a good one on a canvas or whatever the piece of art might be. And I think the idea of the empty spaces having a very big role is really central to Tove, not only because of that principle being quite an important one in art, but also because of her Finnish cultural background. I think the Finnish language is one of it's called a high context language, which means you express a lot of things with very few words, and also what you leave unsaid is meant to communicate, in fact, a great deal. And so, coupled with using sort of emptiness to tell a story, both sort of visually but also thematically, I think is very much who Tove is. I mean, she has said in many interviews that of course, and we know this, that the ending of a story, for example, is the most important bit, but it should leave the reader or the viewer with the possibility to carry on the story themselves in their own fantasy. In essence, you should leave a little bit of an emptiness where things can happen for whomever is actually experiencing the artwork or the painting or the story. And Tove was very good at sort of in a very sparse way expressing very much. I think if you look at, certainly in some of her paintings, but I think it's most poignant in some of her illustrations, with only very few lines, she can paint up a whole atmosphere and scene. And it's a skill that is, I think, very hard to acquire. And I don't know if this is correct, but if we all know Picasso has made some incredible illustrations with about 3 lines, and you can tell a whole story, write a whole novel about those illustrations. And I think Tove had that same quality. She understood the meaning of the empty space, that it's not empty. It's the balance of all the pieces that make up a composition. And sometimes when I have talked to a lot of people who have tried to analyze her short stories, they are almost, in angst because there is so little text in a way, but there is so much meaning. And I think also in Tove's painting, definitely, one should definitely look at the whole composition and not miss out on the bits where not so much maybe happens, but in fact, when you look closer, that might be where it all happens.
Well, that's such a powerful concept to apply to several things at once in her work, and maybe also in her approach to life's complexities as an individual. I think the reference to language and by extension to culture was also really interesting. Tove Jansson seems like a relatively fearless person to me. Is that true to you?
She was incredibly courageous. I mean, now in hindsight, when I know much more about her whole life, the sort of timeline and trajectory of how her life played out and her choices, she's in many ways definitely a female idol for me, and I think for many. I mean, she was born at a time when a woman's role was rather conventional and cut out for her, but she completely goes a different way. And as I already explained, for many reasons, but she actually goes through with it. I mean, she chooses a career that's very unconventional for a woman. She doesn't get married and have children, which was the expected thing to do. Her sexuality is very bold from an early age. She chooses partners of both sexes. In her artistic expression, later on, she creates characters that are very ambivalent about who they are. Hemulans, are they male? They wear dresses, and so on. I mean, and also her outspokenness on, themes about what is right and wrong out of a humanistic perspective, where tolerance is really central, that, everything is about being kind to your fellow being. And so the courage to live out what she thought was right, I admire very much. And, for example, choosing a partner of the same sex in 1950 was not a given. It was forbidden by law in Finland in 1972 to have same-sex relationships. And of course, her generation did it, in secret, but I mean, without hiding it, basically. And so she fell in love with Tuulikki Pietilä in 1956, and they were together until the very end. But I think it's important to understand also that for Tove, it was the individual that was important, not what they looked like or what sex they might have had or creed or nationality or skin color or any of those things.
I think that this bigger picture of Tove Jansson's beliefs and the way she lived her life is it's part of what's fascinated her fans over the years and inspired attention and exhibitions like this one. How did this exhibition come about in the first place?
I think it began when, Didriksen's Art Museum had a wonderful exhibition of Karolina Hellberg, who is a young female painter. And during that exhibition, we got to talking with Maria Didriksen and her daughter, Jenny, and a colleague of ours, Tina, who's a good friend with Jenny. And at that point, an idea was born that Didriksen could host a Tove exhibition. Personally, I think that the Didriksen Art Museum is a great setting for Tove's paintings. I love the fact that they use the old living room of the house and place artworks in it. And when I visited the museum right ahead of opening, it's just a very good setting for, probably for anybody's paintings, but but in this case, for Tove's paintings. So I think the exhibition became more than the sum of paintings. And also the idea to show some of Tove's contemporaries was an excellent decision because it put Tove's paintings into a context where you see influences that she had or, styles that were prevalent at the same time when she was painting, because no painter paints in isolation completely. A painter is always influenced by contemporaries or other previous works of painters that have had a great meaning to them or so on. So it's all in all, I think the exhibition yet again, shines new light on Tove's career as an artist. And that's really, really wonderful.
I think there's a nice parallel in that Tove grew up in a house filled with art, and the Didriksen Art Museum, in fact, also came into being as a house filled with art. I mean, it's a similar relationship between place and art.
Yeah. I've got lots of, situations in my head when art museums or people, curators and such, come and visit the studio or come and pick up paintings from my own home, and they're very careful how they deal with works of art. They have gloves and they're, it's with great respect. And of course it should be that way. But, Tove growing up in a first her father's studio that was, jam-packed with sculptures, finished or unfinished, and all the materials, and her mother's work were all over kitchen or tables and stuff. There was art everywhere, and all the objects became sort of part of your daily life. So, for example, you'd hang your scarf on one of Faffan's sculptures, and the keyring was hanging off of the hand of another sculpture. And there's this irreverence of art that's somehow also quite pleasing. So, of course, I've grown up with that. And so, of course, I never put any gloves on when I touch any of Tove's artworks. And, of course, I realized maybe I should. But it's that idea that they're part of your life. They're part of everything. They are not separate objects that, should be kept in a glass bubble. They're sort of part of this whole that is your life. And that is very much the case for, I think a home like the Didriksens' home, where they lived in amongst art. And it was part of who they were and their daily life. And of course, this is true also for Tove and probably many other artists who live in their studios. And there's something very pleasing about that. I have a nice little sculpture by Tove's father in my bedroom, and it's the most perfect little place to hang all my necklaces on. So it's forever, covered in necklaces. And that's the way it should be, I think. There should be a love of art and a respect for art, but also a sort of inclusiveness about art objects into your life. Let them just be sucked into who you are and part of your life.
I just love the image of one of your grandfather's sculptures with a collection of your necklaces dangling from it, and the whole sense that art should live with us. Now, I'm going to move into a summary style of question here. If Tove Jansson were to walk into the Didriksen Art Museum and see this body of work and the whole experience of it, what would she have thought about this exhibition?
I'm absolutely convinced she would have been very pleased. I think, I mentioned their silliness before, but there was also a great seriousness about their profession. And I think Tove was very much a painter who believed that what she produced was best displayed in public places, that the paintings weren't really for hiding somewhere at home, that an exhibition is the best place for a painting, because in essence, though painting a painting, as I said, for her was perhaps a private process, the idea is for it to be looked at by other people when it's ready and critiqued, liked, bought, displayed, but for more people to enjoy it. I think I have no recollection of her just making things for herself or to hide in some drawer just for herself. Whatever her expression was, it was to be shared. Perhaps not during the process, but when the work was ready, it was definitely to be shared. A book was to be read, an illustration was to be shown, a painting was to be exhibited. So I think she would have been very pleased, and also pleased to have her contemporaries alongside her, because she had great respect for her contemporary painter colleagues. But I'm sure Tove would have been very happy about the exhibition.
Thank you, Sophia. The Tove Jansson exhibition, To Paint is to Be, is open until August 22nd, 2021, at the Didriksen Art Museum in Helsinki.